Okay, so thanks for joining the St. Paul Audubon Society meeting tonight, everyone. Our speaker tonight is Dr. David Remucal. He's the curator of endangered plants at the University of Minnesota's Landscape Arboretum, where he manages the plant conservation program. He's a graduate of University of Colorado and Carleton College, and he previously worked at the Denver Botanical Gardens, the Navajo National Heritage Program, and the USDA Agricultural Lab in Fort Collins, Colorado. He's the conservator of rare native plants, and he's going to be talking tonight about his work at the Landscape Arboretum. So please welcome David Remucal.
Thank you. And thanks for having me here. I appreciate the chance to talk with you all. Let me put up my slide here. Let's see. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, we can see it.
Title slide, excellent. Okay. I'm excited to talk with you all. It's a good time to be starting to think about this. We're in our program, we're looking forward to the field season now. The sun's coming out. It'll get warm at some point here. So it's both good and bad. It's good because it'll be nice for it to be warm, but there's a lot of work to be done. We got a lot to do to get ready. So I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of our program. I'll hit some of our highlights. I've probably got about 45 minutes worth of material-ish in that area. I like being interrupted. I don't mind being interrupted at all. I like taking the questions. I'd rather take the questions as they occur to you when I'm on a slide. That way your questions are fresh and it's not rude to me at all. So definitely speak up if you got something. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, or if my hand is raised, I think I can maybe see that, but yeah. And then I got some pretty pictures at the end too, we've got time. But let's get into it. I'm going to talk today about our plant conservation program. That's the program that I manage at the Arboretum. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about some of our highlights, and I'll also talk a little bit about some of the things that we do that other people can get involved with. We are more and more doing more things that where we're partnering with outside groups and where even individuals can just volunteer with us. We have our own volunteers at the Arboretum, through the Arboretum, that work on site, but we're doing more and more work off site that involves larger groups of people. So I'll kind of chat about those too. So conservation of botanic gardens in general. When most people go to botanic gardens, and even the Arboretum is a pretty good example of this, when most people visit them, you really just see the formal gardens or natural areas, and that's kind of all you really see. There are once in a while a few gardens that have a conservation garden of some kind, where you can see endangered species on display. But to a large extent, it's mostly more formal gardens or larger natural areas that can be conservation in their own right. But the conservation efforts that a lot of botanic gardens see aren't front and center. And a lot of that is because a lot of endangered plants are hard to grow, or they're only there for part of the year, and there's only a few of them. And so it's hard to sort of have a display garden about them. You may see some signs or things like that. But that's about it. And a big reason for that is a lot of the conservation work that botanic gardens do tends to be off-site. Ex situ conservation, which means off-site conservation, is a lot of what botanic gardens do. And it's not called ex situ conservation because it's off the site of botanic gardens. It's because it's conservation off of the natural landscape. So what what a lot of botanic gardens do, there's sort of a wide range of what botanic gardens can do. But a lot of what botanic gardens do around the country that do conservation work is they will do things like they go out and they monitor rare plant species on site. But they'll also do some seed banking. They'll collect seed, or they'll collect individuals of those plants to bring them back, to catalog them, to do research on them. And that's why it's called ex situ conservation, offsite research, or offsite conservation, because they're bringing those plants, or some parts of those plants, or the data away from those sites. That kind of conservation work is really meant to be a complement to in situ conservation efforts, which is what you typically think of when you think of conservation work. These are things like what the Nature Conservancy does, where they buy plots of land and then they preserve the whole plot of land. They'll preserve many acres. A lot of times when the Nature Conservancy buys or targets land, it's because of a specific or a suite of endangered species on that site. And they are protecting the whole suite of ecological, environmental facets that are important for the survival of those particular endangered species. And what we do, we really see as kind of a complement to that work, and an important complement to that work, we feel. So the mission of our plant conservation program is to, let's see here. There we go. The mission is to, we've got these three words: protect, affect, and collect. The idea is we want to protect rare plants. We want to affect change in the region. So we don't want to just bring them back to the arboretum and protect them by collecting data or banking the seed. We also want to have that work and that research mean something. So we want to go out, talk with people about the importance of conservation. We want to go out and actually preserve populations when we can, not just bring them back to the arboretum, but maybe put things back out there, especially if populations disappear. And then we also want to collect. We want to bring material back to the arboretum, not just as a banking effort, but also as another form of outreach. There's going to be a lot of rare plants that I'll show you, both orchid and non-orchid, that most people in the state don't even know are there. And a good way we feel to garner support for the conservation of these species is to just show people they're there, because we have a lot of beautiful plants in Minnesota, as I'm sure most of you know. So there's one question in here: what happens to seeds in a seed bank? And I'll get to that actually in just another slide or two here. But that is important. That's a very important thing to think about when we're starting up a seed bank. Let's see. Good question. That is the top of the list of the things that we do in our particular program. We also are looking at backing up populations. We do research on propagation as well as the production side of propagation. We're doing more rescue and salvage work, which typically involves transplanting, and then demographic work, survey work. It's often attached to most of what we do because it's a very basic data aspect. And one thing to keep in mind too is that a lot of the projects that we have for any individual species will often involve 2 or 3 or 4 or all of these particular aspects. So I like to think of us as kind of a one-stop shop. So my hope is that we build something that when there's something wrong with the species, if the species is disappearing, we can kind of help out with pretty much all aspects of it, even if we can't be there in person too. We can give advice or accept material for folks that are working on these plants. Seed banking. So we'll jump right into the seed bank. And this is a picture of our current seed bank. We've got things kept in envelopes, although we don't have as many paper envelopes in there anymore. We have more of the sort of silver mylar envelopes you see down at the bottom of that picture. And then down here below, these jars are where our orchid seed bank is. Because it's a little easier to keep them in jars than in these envelopes. So the idea with the seed bank is to bring back the genetic resources of populations and store them. The really nice thing about plants is they make these lovely little genetic packages that for most species are hand-built, I guess. They evolved to store for a long period of time, even on their own. But if we kind of store them, if we treat them optimally, dry them down and freeze them, we can get them to store for decades, even centuries. And so we can get out there to some of the really rare species in the state, and we do have some pretty rare ones, and back up each population individually. So we will go out there and we'll collect seed from maternal sources. So each individual plant, and we bring them back and we keep those maternal sources separate, so that if we want to try and, if we have to bring back that population, we can bring them back in the most diverse way as possible. So growing up individuals from each of those maternal sources. And anything that comes to our seed bank, we've got to test. So we need to know how good the seed is going into the seed bank, because if we have dead seed going into our seed bank, we might as well have sand in our seed bank. So it's very important to test our seed, and then test it over time as well. So germination testing is a very important aspect of seed banking. And another thing that we want to do too, and that this is kind of something that's evolving with seed banks around the country that do this kind of thing, is thinking forward as to what is going to happen to the seed in the long term. If we have seed and all that happens to it is it stays there for 50 years and then eventually dies, and we go back out there and collect more seed, if that population is even still there, we've maybe missed some of the opportunity that that seed presents. And so we hope that between our research and research of other folks out there, that we could also offer some of our seed for some of these species for research purposes. Doing things like genetic research, where you may want to look at how much genetic diversity is even available in the species or per population. That kind of research is important, and we want to encourage that, not discourage it. Oops, let's see here. There we go. Population backups. So what this is the creation of a small population, generally from a single population in wild. And this could be backing up in a bed like these in this picture. We've got this whole suite of new beds that we're going to be planting this spring. We also can create populations on the Arboretum in general. The Arboretum is big. It's one of the larger Arboretums around the country, and it allows us a lot of land. And so we can actually create some populations at the Arboretum. And this kind of population, these living banks, are important for a few different reasons. One is that there are some species that are so small and produce relatively few seed that if we can create living banks of these, it allows us to multiply, to amplify seed really quickly. And that would be the case of the Western Jacobs ladder. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit here. Another reason why you maybe want living banks is that some plants can't be stored as seed. Butternut is a good example. Most nut trees, in fact, you can't store the seed. So you either grow it or lose it. So the only way to create a backup for this species is to grow up these trees. And again, the Arboretum is a good place for this. We just this past fall planted 30 or something, I forget what the number was, around 30 butternut trees. We're trying to create a conservation stand for that. It's a little tricky for butternut because one of the reasons why butternut is disappearing is because there's a fungal disease out there that attacks it. So we're kind of hoping that these particular trees aren't attacked by that, but that's why we have put that. And if you're out there visiting the Arboretum, these are out by the dog commons, which is kind of a lesser visited spot in the Arboretum, but that's where they are. And another reason why you may have to do this is because maybe some species don't produce seed at all. The Minnesota dwarf trout lily, a Minnesota endemic plant, is a good example of that. It only grows in one watershed in Minnesota, and that's it. And it's likely because it doesn't produce any seed. So the only way to back up these colonies, these wild colonies, is to bring individuals back to the Arboretum. The good thing about this particular species we found is that it happens to grow really well at the Arboretum, even though we're not within its native range. Its native range is down in the Cannon River watershed. And so we're a few counties away from that, but it does great at the Arboretum. And we still need to capture a few more of the colonies to really kind of represent the genetic breadth of that species, but they've been doing well at the Arboretum. Every spring, and just a few weeks now, we do a spring count of those, and they've been persisting. All of our populations have been sort of, they kind of boom and then persist at a pretty good number. There are some drawbacks to this kind of banking, these kind of living banks, in that a lot of you could probably guess, as soon as you start getting a plant in the ground, you start affecting that plant. So you may find that in a bed, which is a pretty ideal environment, some plants will do really well and some plants will die. And so you're starting selection on that species, on those populations. You may be able to amplify seed, but then you may have influenced what that next generation looks like by that selection you've done on those plants. And so this is just one strategy for most species, if we can do it. We try to amplify, but then we also still rely on any seed collection we can do in the wild, or any additions from wild material. Why would a plant expend the energy to bloom if not to make seeds? It is a question in the chat. It's a really good question, and it's an interesting mystery with this particular plant, with the dwarf trout lily, because it actually will produce seed capsules as well, and it will produce things that look kind of like seeds inside the seed capsule. But you open up those seed capsules, and there's nothing, or you try to grow those seed capsules and nothing happens. They just aren't viable. And another interesting thing about this particular species is, some of you may be more familiar with the other trout lilies. There's a white trout lily and a yellow trout lily that have much larger flowers. And those species produce viable seed. What's interesting is that the dwarf trout lily actually flowers in higher numbers than do the other two species. So that's another interesting mystery to this particular species. Is not only does it not produce seed, it produces more flowers. And why would it do that? Because it's an expenditure of, like you were saying, expenditure of energy. And we don't know. Yeah, it's a very weird plant, very interesting. The way it grows, I don't have any great pictures in there, but the way it grows is interesting as well. The way it grows, it splits vegetatively, and it does this really weird thing with its stem. It doesn't grow like a typical rhizome or a root. It actually kind of bends it takes its stem, it's kind of like this. It takes its stem and it makes a bend in the stem, and that bend is what starts growing out and becomes a new plant. Really interesting. As far as the pollinator, it doesn't seem to be missing a pollinator. There are a lot of things that like to visit this flower. So it has lots of opportunity to move pollen. And I think we've even tried moving pollen between plants, and we'll get capsules, but nothing on them. So interesting. It is something that could really use a whole lot more study for sure. And maybe there'll be an enterprising grad student that wants to come along and look at something like this. But yeah, it's an interesting species for sure. Propagation research. So again, like I mentioned, if you store seeds, you got to know how to grow them. If you don't know how to grow those plants, and you may as well have, again, sand in your seed bank. For a lot of species, a lot of non-orchid species, knowing how to grow them isn't that big of a deal, assuming they can actually germinate and grow. Like the Western Jacobs ladder that I mentioned, we found that it's really easy to grow those seed and even get them to transition to adults and plant them out. But orchids is a special case, and I'll talk about that later. this is where a lot of our propagation research happens, is orchids. Orchids are really hard to propagate. You gotta, at least at this point, you almost always have to do it in a lab. And then once you've got orchid seedlings, trying to get them to move to a pot or to the ground even is also very hard. And this is a reason why people don't typically use orchids in restoration work or even a lot of conservation work, is just because they're really hard to work with. But it's important research, and it needs to be done for any of the species, really. Transplants, we've been doing, like I mentioned, we've been doing a lot more transplants. And this is moving adult plants from one spot to another. And that could be from one spot where they're going to be destroyed to another wild spot where they'll be protected, or it could be moving them from that spot to the Arboretum, where they may be there permanently as kind of a living bank, or they could be there temporarily. And they could be there temporarily in the ground, or they could be there temporarily in pots, and lots of different sort of iterations of that. These could be, there are proactive reasons to do this, and there are reactive reasons to do this. And I see there's a question in there, and I can jump to that real quick. Do you bank spores from ferns as well? And I'm not going to talk about this, but it's something we are beginning. We're just this year starting to work with ferns. It's not clear if fern spores will be able to be banked. And so we're going to start doing that research. What we got to start with first, though, is growing ferns. So we're kind of teaching ourselves how to grow ferns. And there's one particular fern species or fern set of genera, two genera, Botrychium and Septridium ferns in Minnesota that happen to have some really particularly rare, incredibly rare examples, species in Minnesota. And so these are a very large concern to a fair number of the botanists in the state. So we're trying to tackle those. Those are going to be a sort of a step, an order of magnitude harder than orchids, because as hard as orchids are, Botrychium are even harder. No one's been able to get Botrychium to live in captivity for more than a year, I think it is. So it's going to be interesting. So to answer that question, we don't bank the spores, but we're starting to work on those because those are important as well. The ferns are important as well. So transplants. So that, like I mentioned, they can be proactive or they can be reactive. Proactive, the Polemonium is a good example. The Polemonium populations aren't in, at least at this point, specific danger. But we may want to do transplants of that species because there's so few of those populations around. Typically, transplants are more reactive, though. So there can be a particular mine or a particular development that's going to happen on a population, and it may need to, that population is either going to be destroyed or it's going to be moved if you can. So we've been starting to try to get in there and do some of that moving. And I'll talk about a couple of those examples: the tuberous Indian plantain and the ball cactus. And then there's demographic work, and that's really just a lot of survey and monitoring, collecting data. And that's important, both pre and post banking or transplant work. We need to know what was there in the first place. We need to know in the place that it's, if we're moving a plant from an area, we need to know what are the plants that are around it to get an idea of what kind of place we should be moving it to. We need to know what kind of plants are in the area that we moved it to. We want to make sure that we don't move any weeds or any pests with us. So we want to make sure that after we've moved plants, that things haven't changed too much other than the plants, the specific species that we want to move is the one that's establishing there. So this is an important aspect of the work that kind of gets forgotten sometimes by a lot of folks thinking about this kind of work. Is it's a transplant is not just a kind of a in and out one day kind of project. It typically involves a lot of setup and a lot of aftercare. And a lot of that is this demographic work. So now I can start showing you some nice pictures of plants. Western Jacob's ladder, this is one particular species. We've been working with this for a pretty long time now. Oh, in a pretty long time, I should mention, and I forget if this was mentioned already or not, but the plant conservation program started in 2013, and we've been working with this species pretty much from the get-go. So this is a long-lived perennial. You're probably familiar with Jacob's ladder. There are lots of garden versions of Jacob's ladder. Polemonium cerulean is a typical one that people will see. A very pretty plant. And this particular species is related to some of those other Jacob's ladder. The other native species in the state is the spreading Jacob's ladder, Polemonium reptans. But you don't find them in the same spots. Polemonium reptans is only found in the southeast part of the state natively, and then the western Jacob's ladder, this lacustra, occidentale subspecies lacustra, is just found in northern Minnesota. And it's only known from 6 populations, probably just 5. There's 4 populations in Minnesota, 2 in Wisconsin, and the one of the 2 in Wisconsin, we have not been able to find any plants the past few times we've looked. So over the past 6 years, we've looked a couple times and not found any plants there, which is not great. And the other population in Wisconsin doesn't seem to be flowering anymore, which is also not great. We don't know what the specific threats are, other than likely the canopies have closed in those spots. And these, like a lot of rare plants, actually like a little bit of disturbance. But this is a species, those Wisconsin species populations in particular are maybe in dire need of some kind of transplant work. Especially, I'd like to move some back to the Arboretum, get them to flower, induce flowering, and get some seed going from those populations. Something that's interesting about this species is it's a subspecies of occidentale at this point. But a lot of recent genetic work shows that that's probably not actually the case. So previously, what people thought that there's this, on this left slide, there's the, if you go onto USDA plants, this is the range that they have for this particular species, the Polemonium occidentale, the western Jacob's ladder. Most of it's in the Rockies or in the tundra of sort of the boreal areas of North America. And then it's got Wisconsin and Minnesota. But then if you go to the subspecies, that's what is represented on that left side. It's really just the subspecies that are found in Minnesota. So a lot of people thought that it was just a glacial relic left over from the last couple of glacial periods, that it probably was spread across most of the boreal area and just was left here in Minnesota after those retreated. And is just now left in Minnesota and then over in the Rockies. However, the genetic work seems to indicate that probably what happened is there used to be 2 ancient species, Polemonium occidentale and now what people are calling Polemonium lacustra, that existed at the same time, pre-glacial periods, and that the occidentale survived in the mountainous regions as the glacials, as the glaciers came down. But lacustra only hung on in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And these are the only representatives left from that other sister species to occidentale. And so there's a push now to get this get this recognized as an individual species. And if it does become an individual species, it will instantly become one of the rarest plants, not only in Minnesota, but really in North America, with only just a couple of populations. So this is an important species we're working with. Minnesota dwarf trout lily, I mentioned this already, endemic to Minnesota, doesn't produce seed. We've had colonies for about 20 years. And it's doing really well at the Arboretum. So this is a close-up picture of the flower. The typical white and yellow trout lily flowers are usually about 2 to 3 times as big flower-wise as the white trout lily. So you really can't get them confused if you run across them in the wild when they're flowering. That being said, the leaves look pretty much identical. I think theoretically, if you were to measure a bunch of leaves and do the statistics on them, The dwarf trout lily leaves are smaller than the other leaves, but if you're in a population walking through these, and then you'll find them mixed together in the wild for sure. You won't be able to tell the difference from the leaves because there are young plants and there are older plants, and it's just hard to know. The tuberous Indian plantain is one of the species we've done a rescue with. This was interesting. This is one of our first rescues. Prior to this, doing this rescue of this particular site, which was on a sandstone mine, salvage work really hadn't been done in Minnesota. It's just not something it's not viewed as a form of mitigation for endangered species. In other states, they have it as a form of mitigation, but not in Minnesota. And we're hoping to change that. But I do want to acknowledge that there are legitimate reasons. The DNR is not, there are understandable reasons. Even if I want them to change, there are understandable reasons that the DNR has for the system that they're doing, that they've currently been working with. But we've been trying to work with changing this. And this is one of the species and populations we've done. These are kind of related to the common plantain that you'll find as a weed. The leaves look very similar. We took one population, the largest population in Minnesota, moved a bunch of adult individuals and collected a bunch of seed and moved them to 3 state protected land locations, and then 1 population at the Arboretum. The downside, or the unfortunate thing about this particular project, was that of all those 4 populations, only the Arboretum population has been persisting as far as we understand. There's 1 population that I've lost track of, and that we're not in charge of monitoring that particular population, so I'm not sure how it's doing. But I'm not optimistic about that. But it's good that our population is doing well. It's flowering every year. And it seems to be persisting pretty well. Hasn't started recruiting yet, but it's in an area of really thick vegetation, so we're not going to know if it's really recruiting until that second generation starts flowering. But we have a ton of seed from that site, so the good thing is that we can kind of keep trying. We'll be able to keep trying, keep bringing up more plants, and we do really well with this plant from seed. So we have lots of opportunity to try again. So I'm sure we will with this particular species. Ball cactus. So this may be one that if you knew about any of our work at the Arboretum without coming to the Arboretum or seeing me talk before, this may be the one species. Because there was an article about this particular project in the Star Trib last summer. Minnesota has cacti. For those of you that don't know, a lot of people don't know that Minnesota has 3 cactus species. 2 of them are prickly pears, and they're fairly common, fairly easily found in sandy prairie areas. And then there's this guy, the ball cactus, Escobaria vivipara. It's only found in 1 population in Minnesota, way over in Big Stone County, and it's more common as you get sort of further west, like the Rockies and down to Arizona. But even out there, it's often listed. But it just peaks its most eastern point, just into Minnesota. It lives on granite outcrops, and the one population is spread out. It's a pretty sprawling population. It's big enough that it actually crosses into several different properties, and 2 of those properties are on sort of inactive-ish granite quarries, or at least not active on this particular spots where the cactus live, because they can't. They need to get permits from the DNR. But the quarries want to become active again where these cacti are. They want to get at these rocks. So we got a grant from the LCCMR, which is the lottery money, to try and move these plants. We've been doing a couple of things. We're sort of in the middle of a 2-year window to try and do this project. And one of the first things we did was we got out there and tried to bank as much seed from these quarry sites as we could. And we've been able to bank a lot of seed, which is fantastic because the permitting process for these quarries is dragging on still. And it looks like we're not going to hit our window to move these adult plants. So what we've done instead is we've been growing up hundreds of seedlings so that we can sort of virtually move these populations, these adults, to their new sites from this wild collected seed. And we're going to move them to the nearby National Wildlife Refuge, which already has some cacti on them. But there are some outcrops that don't have cacti on them. And then we're going to move to a nearby TNC site as well that has outcrops, but does not have at least any recent history of the cactus on them. So we're excited about this project. We're really excited to be able to partner with TNC and the National Wildlife Refuge. It's really nice to be able to partner with groups because Minnesota's a big state. And the more partnering we can do, the better, because we only have, as of this spring now, 3 people, full-time people on staff at our plant preservation program. So we're spread pretty thin. So anyway, this is exciting. We're going to do this planting this fall. Best time to plant these will be in the fall when everything's dormant. And then we'll keep an eye on them. We're not walking away after our 2-year period with this project. We're going to keep monitoring it. And we're hopeful that we'll still be able to kind of get in there and move some of these plants. One of the quarries has even offered to help fund our work if they finally get the permit to work with these plants, to take these plants. So we're going to keep going with these. Let's see. So these species, and I said I didn't mention this for the Indian plantain, but a lot of the species we work with, a lot of the rare species in Minnesota are rare because they're on the edge of their range. They may be more common elsewhere, but they're on the edge of their range. And this is one of the things that people will often ask is, if they're more common somewhere else, why do we even care about them? And some of these are going to be, I'm sure many of you are aware of these reasons. Oh, someone asked what the TNC site is. Sorry, I didn't mention that. It's going to be Plover Prairie. It's really close to the populations out there of the cactus. So that'll be exciting. We'll be excited. We're very excited to have those out there. So there are biological reasons to save these plants, save these populations, these edge of range genetics. And the basic reason for that is that the basic genetic reason is that these edge of range will often, the genetics often represent selection for survivability in areas that the heart of the range can't adapt to, which is, especially in a climate changing world, that's really important. So those genetics can become really important for the ability of that species to maybe survive the changing climate. So that's a reason why we want to hang on to these species, or hang on to these parts of the range of the species. That's why they're important to us. But there's also a non-biological reason that are also very valid. And this picture of these cacti, this is the ball cactus flower. Cactus flowers are just beautiful if you haven't seen them before. Is a demonstration of that. And why I preserve some of these rare species, edge of range species, is because they're beautiful. And it's kind of, it may sound cynical, but we work with, one of the reasons we were excited to bring the ball cactus to the Arboretum, grow up some of these seedlings and then potentially display it at the Arboretum, is that it is beautiful. It's a cute little plant. Cacti are very charismatic, and plants kind of suffer a dearth of charisma for typical folks. Botanists will often call it plant blindness, where you'll go on a nature walk, and it could be in the spring, and there's all kinds of beautiful trees and flowers and all this greenery around you, but you'll hear a bird or you'll hear an insect or something, or you'll see an animal, and that's what you remember when you're done with that walk. I like to say that plants don't really have pandas and elephants and tigers and lions, all the sort of large mega fauna, charismatic ones. But we do have some things that do strike a chord with people. Cactus is one of those species, is one of those groups of plants that strikes a chord. Orchids are another one. Carnivorous plants are another one, especially with kids. And so we are working with all of those, with all three of those groups in our plant conservation program, because they are great ambassadors for plant conservation. It's not the only reason, but it's a very good reason for us. We can bring them and get people kind of excited about these species, and then they'll be excited maybe about these other species that are interesting in Minnesota. When do ball cactus bloom? These guys will bloom, I think it's in early June. It kind of depends on the year, but probably the month, sort of the whole month of June, I think, can be kind of the window, depending on if it's an early or a late year. Yeah. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of our larger projects. And these are potentially some opportunities for folks to get involved with too. How am I doing on time here? 7:40. Okay, not too bad. I want to talk a little bit about the Anoka Sandplain Rescue Network. This is a new thing that we just officially started last summer. You can see a whole bunch of folks here working on one particular group. So the Anoka Sandplain, which probably a lot of you are familiar with if you're interested in wildlife and you're living in St. Paul. I mean, the Anoka Sandplain isn't too far off from you. It's a biodiversity hotspot in Minnesota. There's a couple of biodiversity hotspots, and this is one of them. There's a really high percentage of listed species found in this area, and that includes plants. There's also in this particular area, there's a lot of development that's happening. It's kind of a confluence of really desirable development land and really desirable biodiversity land. And so for a while now, plants have been disappearing from the Anoka Sandplain landscape because of development. And so there's been a group of folks that have been concerned about this, and we've kind of all coalesced at the right time now to begin this project. Let's see, there we go. So we're partnering with the Anoka Conservation District and with an environmental consulting firm, the Critical Connections Environmental Services, Jason and Amy Huspeth, if any of you recognize those names. And this is a pilot program for us. This is something that I've been trying to get together, something that I've been trying to pursue ever since I got here, really, to the plant, ever since we kind of started the plant conservation program in 2013. But it's a big lift. This kind of project requires a lot of people. It requires a lot of different kinds of expertise, and a lot of hands, and a lot of eyes. So we finally got some folks together and started it last year, as I mentioned. And last year, just in the 1 year, we either rescued or banked about 14 species, which is, oh wait, no, not 14, 26, I forget what the number is. I think there's, so we've got about, let's see, we've got 16 here, but that number is actually higher, especially if you include banking, seed banking. I think we're about up to 26 or something like that. I forget what that number is. Sorry about that. I need to update those numbers. That's pretty good in a single year. We did about, what did we do? 3 or 4 rescues that involved multiple species. We did some separate seed banking efforts as well. And then we also did a couple of experiments. And someone did help on one of these, which is great. I love to see that. It's a fun time, I think, for a lot of the folks. That's a whole separate talk we could give, and we actually will be giving that. We're just in, this is kind of a preview talk for you folks. In about April, we're going to kind of do a more official sort of burst of information and offering talks to folks, really kind of rolling out the recruitment for this. Yeah. Let's see here. So yep, here's more information, just kind of talking about what we're doing. There's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of aspects to this. Don't worry about absorbing this slide. The good thing is that I guess it'll be on your recording, so you'll be able to come back to it later if you want to. And we're going to get something like this up on our website as well, and I'll get you that information. I'll also give you the information on how to contact Carrie Taylor, who's the Anoka Conservation District and kind of leading on the volunteer recruitment or volunteer management at this point for this group. But the idea really is to drill down on the Anoka Sand Plain and do as many of these rescue projects as we can, and eventually sort of move this out across the state. We want to create, it's proof of concept, essentially. We want to show the DNR that we can do transplants. Sometimes transplants will fail, but we can learn about the ones that fail. And so one of the big products that we'd like to give to the DNR, or I've kind of foresee in this kind of work with the DNR, is that we can show them, hey, these are the species you probably really need to pay attention to protect, because if they get destroyed, they're gone. And then we could say, here are some other species that we actually can move these. We've shown that we can move these. And so if you need to, if it's sort of an either or, we could help with these plants. We can help move these plants. We kind of know what to do. That makes it a little more, it makes it a little, hopefully what I'm hoping, it'll make it a little bit easier for the DNR to make some of those decisions. They'll be more informed. And they'll be able to better sort of target their resources to really focus on the species that absolutely need protection, that cannot do with being moved. And then there's another project, and this one is we're still trying to get this off the ground. We got an LCCMR, we think we're going to get LCCMR funding for this, but the LCCMR this year, for those of you that don't know, has struggled a bit with sort of moving along their allocation process. And we're in line to be allocated. It hasn't become official yet. But our hope is we're going to start this project this summer, where we will call in volunteers, train a set of volunteers that would like to become rare plant hunters, basically. There's this whole suite of old information on rare plant populations that haven't been visited in a while, sometimes decades, and a lot of populations that haven't been visited in decades. And for a lot of rare plants, if you don't visit them, if you don't visit them regularly, you don't really have an idea what's going on with them. And the DNR is doing a lot of this work, but there's just too much out there for them to handle all of these populations. So we want to create kind of a trained core of volunteers that can go out there and look for plants. We'll have some folks that are really interested in just the exploring part, and they can go out all across the state and explore. We'll have some folks that are kind of centered in their parts of the state and they're really interested in this work, but they maybe really like a particular SNA. And there is a species there that we would really love to keep an eye on. And so they could go out every year or two and just go out and track that one population. It's all valuable information. So we'll kind of take whoever can come out and is interested in that. And then we'd also like to train some folks, sort of a more dedicated set of volunteers, to become even more highly trained to become seed collectors with us as well, to help us bank seed, because it's the same issue with seed banking. There's a lot of populations we'd like to bank out there, a lot to protect, but we're really small staffed. And we're based in the Twin Cities, so getting out to some of these parts of the state is hard. We're limited in what we can get to any one particular year. So this is our group. These are the groups that we've kind of partnered with at this beginning stage. And there's each of these groups will kind of fulfill a specific role. The DNR, we're going to partner with we'll be kind of leading this group with the DNR. The DNR will most likely manage the volunteers and contribute to some of the training. We will help with training as well as doing the seed banking. The Minnesota Master Naturalists have a really good, for those of you that are part of the Master Naturalists, you've got a fantastic sort of digital space where you have a lot of classes and training online. So we're hoping to tap into that training system and to allow us to be able to train folks around the state, not just Twin Cities based folks. And you also have a bunch of folks as master naturalists that are aligned really well with this kind of project that might want to jump in and be highly motivated and trained, interested volunteers right from the get-go. The Native Plant Society has a lot of really highly knowledgeable botanists that can do a lot of training, not just for general training, but some specialist training. Because one of the things we kind of envision in this is that we'll get some volunteers who get really interested in sedges or some other group of plants in the state, and we can kind of train them to become specialists in these groups of plants and get really excited about them. And that's where Native Plant Society folks would come in. The Bell Herbarium is interested in this work because they have a lot of old records that we would love to verify, especially records that are pre-GPS. If you look at some of these records, they will say something to the effect of, if you want to find this plant where we collected this, go down 2 miles past the beginning entrance to this park, and there'll be a big rock. And that big rock is where you find this plant, which 50 or 60 years ago, maybe where it was, but now that rock may not be there. That park may not be there. The path may not be there. So we need folks who are willing to go out and do a little bit of hunting and help us find some of this. Prairie Enthusiasts is another fantastic group. We work with some prairie enthusiasts. We know that they would be potentially really interested, especially in some specific plots of lands. They could be really great sort of long-term monitors for us. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interested groups. We just need to kind of get this thing off the ground. We're starting small. Well, we're going to start relatively small. Our goal for the first couple of years is really to train up maybe a couple dozen folks. We really kind of want to. There are other states that do this kind of volunteer corps, but this is new to us in the state. So there's a lot of parts that we need to get the kinks worked out of. We need to get the certification process. We need to get the trainings. We need to get the sort of the information distribution put together, and the management, the volunteer management. So we're going to start small, but we're hoping that we can, again, show this is a valuable program, get it up and going, and then really just open it up, bring in anybody interested. Not to say that we would turn away anybody that was interested in the first place. It's just that we want to kind of temper expectations a little bit and just have everybody realize that it's going to take a couple of years before we can maybe be fully up and running. But we're very excited and hopeful for this program. We think it meets a lot of needs and meets a lot of interest too. So I'll talk pretty briefly about our native orchid conservation program. There's 46 about, kind of depending on if you're a lumper or a splitter as far as a species name person, taxonomy person. There's 46 species, and we're trying to work on all of those in Minnesota. They're not all listed. Only about a quarter of the species in Minnesota are listed. About a fifth of the species in Minnesota are listed. But across North America, about half of all species are listed in some form or other. And even for a lot of the orchids, even the ones that are regarded as common, really aren't that common. There's probably several species that ought to be listed that aren't at the moment. So we're trying to work on all of them. And the reason we're working on all of them is because there's just so much unknown about Minnesota's native orchids and terrestrial native orchids in general. Most of the orchid work that's done is done on tropicals because that's what everybody wants to breed and show. So most of the propagation research that's been done on orchids and growing is on tropicals, which is great, but doesn't help us a ton. So we're trying to do that research for each of those species. It's super interesting work, very lab-based though. As I mentioned before, orchids are pretty much started in labs at this point, even tropical ones. There are very few orchids where you can take the seed, throw it in the ground, and get an orchid. So most of it is started in labs, started in beakers like this on the left, these two beakers. And this is just showing one of our experiments where we've got two different media types. It's the same species. This species very obviously likes the lighter colored media. It doesn't like that darker media as much. And a very big reason why orchids are so hard to grow is because most orchids have this fungal relationship. They have this symbiotic isn't quite the right word, but it's used a lot with orchids. They have this relationship with soil fungi, where they need the soil fungi to germinate for sure in most cases, and probably survive as adults as well. There's a couple of species that's maybe not quite as important, like lady slippers, that maybe not quite as important. But for a lot of the other ones, especially this really small species, the fungi are really important. So we're working more with the fungi too. And that's, as much as orchid research is a Wild West, the fungi are a real Wild West. I mean, we've isolated fungi from probably 30 or so species in Minnesota. And so we've got about 300 fungi growing in our lab. Probably 2/3 or 3/4 of those fungi have never been identified by anybody before. People just haven't been paying a lot of attention to these fungi. So there's just a lot of information to get through, and a lot of work to be done. But it's very interesting, and it's fun to get those moments where, like in this lower plate, this is Leparis locellii, which is Losel's toy blade. It's actually a fairly common orchid you can find in sort of open wetland area types prairies around central Minnesota and northern Minnesota. This is an orchid that's growing on a media with a fungi that if these orchids were on the media without the fungi, they would be dead. But they're doing really well with this fungi. So this is one of those moments where, like, we hit it. We got the combination. We're super psyched about that. Someone asked about Orchids Limited. I actually don't know if they're doing native orchids or not. That's a good question. I should find that out. Wasn't clear. When I'd first come on and started working with orchids, I kind of talked with them, but they weren't super forthcoming about information. So I haven't reconnected with them about the work they've done. So I'm not exactly sure, unfortunately, with what species they're doing. Sorry. But there are, if you're interested in getting showy lady slippers, for example, there are folks you can get them from in the state, including us this spring. We're going to try actually selling them at our plant sale. So that's neat. So anyway, orchid conservation, we're doing a lot with orchid conservation. There's a lot of need there, a lot of work to be done. Super interesting research, super interesting. These are some of the species. We've got some really beautiful orchids in the state, really, really beautiful, and some really interesting ones. And I'll get into some more of those pictures later if you're interested. But this is how to get involved. So I'm pretty much wrapping up at this point. These are some of the things that I talked about. These are ways, some contact information for you. Carrie Taylor with the Anoka Conservation Group, I mentioned that. The Rare Plant Survey Group, contact me. I'll have my email up there in the next slide, I believe. Let me know in the next month or two if you're interested. I saw that there was somebody who was interested. So shoot me an email and I'll get you on a list. Really hoping to get this off the ground. It's been this and the rescue group kind of project are things that I've been really after for a while. Come to the Arboretum. We will have some orchids on display this spring in the wildflower garden, wildflower woodland garden. So that'll be exciting. And we've even had some here and there flowering as well. We've got some rare plants out in along the bog walk and out in the prairie that we'd love to have you come see. You can volunteer with that rare species, the Minnesota Rare Species Group. This isn't us specifically, but Derek Anderson, some of you may have worked with him or know him. He's great. They do a lot of monitoring. You can go out and he'll do dwarf trout lily monitoring out in the wild locations in the spring, and you can go join him on some of that kind of work. Let's see. So, yep, feel free to contact all those. Let's see. And here's my contact information, especially this last line. This is our website. It's not super up to date at the moment, but this will be a place where you'll be able to get more information, especially about those projects. And yeah, you'll be able to get more information on these projects, as well as more information sort of in general about some of the things that we're doing. Let's see. Let me take a look at the chat here quick. Show you ladies up on rotting wood. Yep, rotting wood is great. We use a lot of rotting material for our growing material. Hannah Teller, I don't know Hannah Teller. There's another Hannah, and so I'm not sure if maybe you're thinking of that Hannah Texler. Yeah, oh yeah, Texler. There we go. Yes, yes. She's retired. She was very involved with this, with us. We worked with her. She's retired. I don't know what she's doing at the moment. That's a good question. But she was. But we're working with like Bruce Carlson and Derek and some other folks, especially some northern Minnesota folks. So we work with. There's a whole bunch of DNR folks that we work with. Someone asked, if I find a plant that is not reported in the county, how do I report it? That's a good question. I would say contact the DNR, because that's what we would do. If you were to tell us, we would just turn around and tell that to the DNR. They keep county records for sure. You could always send that information to Derek Anderson. I don't know if he would be the person to send, if he's the person that collects that information. He probably is not, but I can't think of off the top of my head who that might be. There's a couple of candidates, but he's a good person to kind of start with. He can get you directed to the right person. And he would especially like to know if it is, he would want to know that anyway, if it was happened to be a listed species. So he's a good person to start with. Yeah, so that's it. That's the talk. I'm happy to take more questions now. I will, let's see. Gosh, forward here. Okay, so here is the first slide that I got in my little orchid talk. I can talk about orchids. I can talk about orchids all day. That's a whole separate talk if you're interested in orchids. Really, there's just a whole bunch of our work that could be their own separate talks. We're doing a lot of different, really, I think, of course, interesting things. Yeah, I'm happy to keep blabbing away if you want. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm happy to stop, let you all go. I don't know if you have business, more business to attend to as part of your group, but anyway, thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. Thanks for listening. I know plants aren't necessarily always everybody's cup of tea, but it's great to be able to give out some of this information, for sure.
Yeah. David, thank you very much. How many slides do you have of orchids?
I probably in the range of 10 to 15. Not all the orchid species, just kind of some of the highlights.
Okay. Well, I'd be happy to stay on and look at your photos and hear a little bit about them. And I also have a question about your work with butternuts. You mentioned that fungus attacks the butternut, And I was wondering, is there any cause in your work to try to protect them from the fungus, or is that part of the work to discover which ones are resistant to it?
Yes, that is a good question. So butternut is a really interesting story in the state. The quick answer to that is that there isn't really a way that we know to protect it. And so far, there hasn't really been any resistance in native butternut. What's tricky about butternut, not only in the state, but kind of anywhere, is that there are introduced related species that have hybridized with butternut. And so there's a fair number of butternut in the state that are not native butternut anymore. Like the state champion was kind of recently decided that that's the state champion tree, which is in Rosemont, I think. I forget where it is not actually a butternut, it's a hybrid. So that makes it hard because even if you find something that's resistant, it may not be a native butternut that's resistant.
So hybrid with a black walnut or with what?
Yeah, that's one that they can hybridize with. But there's like a Japanese walnut, I think, that it hybridizes with. I forget, there's a few different species that it can hybridize with. And they're really hard to tell in the field as well. They're really hard to tell if they're hybrids, or yeah, they're really hard to tell if they're hybrids. So one of the projects we'd like to do is we would like to identify which trees in state are even native butternut trees. It would be a pretty simple genetic test that we would do. There's some folks around the country that can do that test for us. One of the issues is that a lot of the folks that have historically been interested in butternut are retiring. And so we're kind of losing a lot of institutional knowledge about that particular species, which is not great. We're hopeful that in some of this work that we're doing with butternut, that we run across a tree or more than one tree that is resistant. A large number of the trees that we do have that we're planting are from a recently discovered population in Nebraska, which is a little bit out of the range of its normal native range, but these are native trees, and this stand of butternut is very healthy. And it could be that the 1,000 cankers just hasn't gotten there yet, but it could be that maybe they're resistant. And so we're hoping that maybe there's some resistance in these trees. We're going to grow them up and see. Yeah. Plant, it's very difficult. Yeah, on top of the a true strain of butternut as well, and you may not know that it's native. So it's tough. Is it a xylem phloem problem? As far as the canker goes, the fungus goes, I don't think that's the issue. I guess I don't know that for sure, but I don't think that's the issue. But because they create cankers, but I don't think it's I don't think the canker are necessarily a ringing thing. They don't ring the tree and then kill it. I think it's sort of systemic. But I don't know enough about the sort of specific biology of the canker to be able to really describe that. Oh man, and then there's the hemlock, eastern hemlock. That's another tree that we're working with. That's a really super interesting story that I don't have time to talk about, but invite me back and I'll tell you about eastern hemlock. That's a really cool story. Okay, so orchids. A fairy slipper orchid. This is a really pretty orchid we have in the state that's probably ought to be listed. It's really pretty hard to find. And when you do find it, you almost never find it. And numbers for this orchid is like, if you can find 30 plants in an area, you're doing great. But it's something that if you've seen pictures of orchids in state, you probably have seen a picture of this particular orchid because the flower is so beautiful. interesting about it, you just see a close-up of the flower and that's it. One of the big Sharpies. It's a little plant. It's a very little plant. So it's really easy to completely miss it if you're in the areas where it lives. Really cool. And it's a really interesting plant, and it's a good demonstration of some of the interesting biology of orchids in that it comes up really early in the spring, and it's pollinated by bumblebees. And specifically, it's pollinated by these new queens that come out looking for food, and it's the only thing that's out there flowering. And so it gets visited by these new queens, and it specifically needs the new queens because it doesn't offer any rewards. So it's got to rely on a bumblebee that doesn't know that these flowers don't give you anything. So it'll get a bumblebee that'll visit a few of its flowers, and then give up on that flower and probably never visit them in the future, which is a really interesting strategy to do if you're a plant. Doesn't seem like it's the most successful kind of strategy, but that's what these guys do. So it's yeah, it's orchids are fascinating, very fascinating reproductive biology. Looking for these, by the way, typically you'll find them in sphagnum bogs, sphagnum conifer bogs in northern Minnesota. But you have to look very early, April, May, kind of depending on when the snow goes out is when you'll see these things flower. And then that's it. By the end of May, they're pretty much gone from the landscape, or at least they become really hard to find. They aren't going to be in flower anymore. Small white lady slipper. These are interesting because they're actually relatively common for orchids in the state, but they're still listed in Minnesota kind of as an acknowledgement that anywhere else in the country that you look for them, they're really hard to find. Minnesota just happens to sit on the sort of the main part of its range. And so it's not actually too hard to find this orchid. You'll find it flowering, again, early June. You'll find it in wet prairie types of areas, typically. It looks a lot like the showy lady slipper. It's just pure white flowers, and much shorter. Typically a foot tall tops is what you'd see. And we have these. We've gotten a couple of these to flower in pots for us. And we'll get these put out. We're gonna try to plant them out in our prairie, although our prairie vegetation is really thick, so they may not do well. But they're gonna go out in a bed at the this spring, so you'll be able to come see these this year. They may not flower this year, but we should be able to get some flowering in a year or two out in beds, which is great. There we go. Moccasin flower or pink lady slipper. This is one that is probably the least seen of our lady slippers because it doesn't do well in captivity so far, and it's not found near the Twin Cities typically either. You can find it in northern Minnesota, either in sphagnum bogs or in some drier jack pine kind of woodlands. Very pretty, very different than other lady slippers. It doesn't have the sort of long leafy stalk that the other lady slippers tend to stick up. That's why it's called the stemless. All of its leaves tend to be right at its base, and then it'll stick up this single stem with these pink flowers. And the slipper doesn't look quite the same as the other lady slippers do in the state either. But well worth it if you can find it. It's very pretty. It's not that uncommon, but it's just the landscapes that you find it in are a little harder to get to. What the delay is on this, but there's the ram's head lady slipper. This is a listed orchid in the state. Maybe will become federally listed at some point. It's very pretty. We have had it growing at the Arboretum. You may have been lucky to catch it. There was some rescues that came to the Arboretum a few years a couple of years before I got to the Arboretum, and by the time 2014 or so rolled around, they hadn't survived, unfortunately. The good news is that we've been really pretty successful with seed plants of this. We have a fair number of plants in pots, nothing flowering yet, but we're hoping that in the next year or two, we'll be able to get some to flower. And so we should be having these planted in beds as well soon at the Arboretum that you can visit. We were involved with a few reintroduction projects with this as well. A lot of folks are interested in trying to see this thing stick around. Tuberous grass pink. This is a really pretty flower. If you've seen any orchids at the Arboretum, any of our orchids, this is probably the one you've seen. There's a bog demonstration bed by our iris pond that you could see these flowering every year. Really cool, pretty flowers. This is a little deceiving in that the flowers are kind of small. They're probably only about an inch wide, but they're really pretty. Really interesting biology again of the flowers. These flowers, they actually present upside down. They're upside down compared to all the other orchid flowers. The lip is actually that thing, that yellow thing up at the top, and it looks like it has pollen, but it doesn't. And it tricks its pollinators into coming to visit. And then so they fly away without getting any pollen or any nectar. Yeah, very cool plant. This is another one that we've actually been very, very successful in growing from seed. So we're excited to have that to show. Because this is a plant that's really hard to see in the wild, because it generally just grows on sphagnum mats that aren't even solid sphagnum mats. They tend to be on sort of lake shores or perched above water, so they're really spongy. And if you go walking out on them, you could potentially just put your foot right through them and sink all the way down to the water. So this is a good thing to bring to the Arboretum. Let's see. What time is it now? About 8:17. I can keep going for a couple more if people like. Otherwise, I can stop. I'll kind of leave it up to folks. Someone asked the question, what is the advantage of this orchid to attract insects? That's a good question that a lot of orchid ecologists and a lot of people in general, evolutionary biologists, this is one of the reasons why orchids are so interesting. Darwin was super interested in orchids for a lot of the same question. Is a lot of orchids do really strange things as far as flowering and their pollinators. They'll flower at really weird times, like that one orchid that flowers just at the beginning of the year and then goes away, really looking for a certain pollinator. A lot of orchids don't offer rewards. They've got to trick their orchids, or trick their pollinators. There's the really famous example, maybe some of you have seen the video with David Attenborough narrating, where he talks about these orchids, these Ophrys, I can't remember how to pronounce it. These orchids that are found in Europe that have all these different orchid species within this genus have evolved to mimic different pollinators. They look exactly like the pollinators. And so the males of those pollinators will come by, try to mate with that flower. And in the process of mating with it, they'll pick up pollen, move off, try to mate with another flower and drop off that pollen on that next flower. So why do they do this instead of offering rewards? That's a really good question. And it's not, I don't think anybody at this point has a really good answer, except that even though it's a strange strategy, it's really successful, because orchids are one of the largest plant families out there. There's only one plant family that's larger, and that's the asters, the sunflower family. And even that, they kind of go back and forth depending on who's discovering more species. There's a lot of different orchid species, and so they've been successful. They're a lot of orchids are rare. And so it seems like likely they kind of get into this groove where they get this specialization with a pollinator, and they stick with it. And they keep splitting off evolutionarily as different pollinators pop up or something. But it's a really interesting story. A lot of interesting things to study. So it's a good question. And I don't have a great answer in that regard. How are they fertilized if pollinators aren't doing it? There are some orchids. There's one orchid in Minnesota that is the flowers don't open, and so it pollinates itself. So that happens sometimes. I think there are some orchids that if they lose their pollinators, they're done. They're kind of done as a species. They'll hang around for a while as they vegetatively propagate, but if they lose their pollinators and can't recover another one, they may be in trouble. That's one of the concerns with the federally listed orchid in the state, the Western Prairie Fringed Orchid. I don't know if I've got a picture of that. I think I've got a picture of it. I don't know if I have it in this slideshow or event or not in this one, but that hasn't that is pollinated. People think it's pollinated by a certain sphinx moth. I forget what this species of moth is, but a certain moth that may not be really around anymore. So there's some concern that species may be kind of on its way out. I don't know the details on that terribly well, so I can't tell you the full story on that, but that's a good question. The answer might be that they might not be pollinated if the pollinators aren't around to do it. There's one particular population of white lady slippers that we're concerned about because we cannot get it to set any seed. It doesn't seem to set seed on its own. We think the population, pollinators might be gone in that population. Let's see. Someone 2 hours south along the Mississippi restored most of their 500 acre farm. They found 10 orchid species in remnant areas, including the October lady species. Oh, cool. That's great. I've talked with some folks that have done that. They've done some restoration, and orchids have found their way back, which is fantastic. That's typically a good sign. Orchids are often kind of referred to as the canary in the coal mine. It's an overused term, but it means something. That orchids are often the first species to disappear from a landscape, and in many cases, the last to come back. That's not always the case, last to come back, but they are often the first to disappear. So typically, if you've got orchids on your site, it's generally healthy. The soil is probably doing pretty good. It's generally pretty healthy. So it's a good sign. Rattlesnake plantains, these are an interesting species. These are evergreen. And do I have pictures of their flowers? I don't even have pictures of their flowers because the flowers are what's really interesting. They've got these small white flowers. They're pretty. But what's really pretty about these flowers is the leaves. They've got these reticulated leaves. And if any of you have seen any of these, you probably will have seen the one on the bottom right, Goodyear pubescens, because you can find those kind of approaching the Twin Cities area. The other two species you can find, but you can find them further north. That repens is really little, so it's often overlooked. But this tessellated rattlesnake plantain on the bottom left, you would see that in pine woodlands. It's one of the few kind of really dry orchid species. So you might find that'll be an orchid you might run across if you're wandering around in some of the pine woodlands in northern Minnesota. This one is another one that has done really well with us with the fungi. Let's see. The Paris liliofolia, lily-leaved twig blade. If you were to have seen an orchid in the Twin Cities walking around in the woods, maybe some abandoned woodland areas behind in your backyard or by your backyard or something like that, this may be the orchid you've seen. It's one of the more common orchids in the Twin Cities area, and in woodland areas in sort of central and southern Minnesota in general. Although the metro areas, easier place to find it. It's got these really pretty purple flowers. It doesn't get very big. It only gets a few inches tall. But this is one that you may have actually seen in the Twin Cities area. Again, flowering in June. Most orchids are not late flowering species. Most orchids are earlier flowering. Let's see. Oh, how do prairie or forest fires affect orchid survival? Good question. Prairie species, orchid species are all adapted to it. They seem to do well. The small whites. Interesting because it hasn't been. We got, and after the burn, we got a big flush of flowers. But even with that flush of flowers, we didn't get any seed set. And for the next couple of years, we didn't get it. We haven't gotten any seed.